sure it's a means. Just because I'm free to say whatever I want to say doesn't mean that I should say whatever I want to say. Freedom means you can't stop me from saying the right things, but I have to control myself. The government shouldn't do it for me, but I have to do it myself. I have to develop saying the right thing. So freedom is when people say crazy and stupid things, what's freedom of speech? We're not talking about putting the police on your case. We're talking about putting your internal police. Yes, you do have freedom of speech. The government allows you to say the stupidest things, which people take advantage of very often. But that doesn't mean you should allow yourself to be convinced that freedom is license. Freedom is not license. Freedom means you cannot be controlled by a government, but you have to control yourself. So the immature takes freedom as an end, and the mature takes freedom as a means to an end. Okay, the Haggadah. We already discussed the Haggadah, but what is it based on? There's a biblical verse that says, V'hi gadita lebincha, you shall tell it to your children. So that's why the book that contains the story of the Exodus is called Haggadah, the telling. It's the telling of the story. And I already mentioned that we're supposed to remember the Exodus every day and every night, but Passover, it's telling the story. It's elaborating on it. And in the Haggadah, it says, as we'll soon see, that even if you're wise and you know everything, you read the book 17 times, you watched the movie 30 times, you know the story, you still have to tell the story that night. Why would you retell something you already know so well? Because you're reliving it. You're reliving it. Okay, the first paragraph of the Haggadah, actually, the beginning of the Haggadah is a list of 15 items that will cover the whole Seder. And that's why it's called Seder, it's called order. Even before we start, we know what we're going to do this night. Generally, Judaism is not organized religion, it's disorganized religion. A late colleague of mine was trying to put together a minyan on Yom Kippur. This was in Boston, Massachusetts. And he's calling people because he was short of 10 for the minyan and Yom Kippur. We couldn't bear going through the holiest day of the year without a minyan. So he calls up this man and he says, "Can you please come to my house?" He had the minyan in his house. "I'm short of a few people. I need 10. And the man says, "Okay." He says, "What about your son? Could he come as well?" And he hears the son shout, "I don't believe in organized religion." So the rabbi says to the father, "Tell your son that if I have to call right before Yom Kippur to get a minyan for Yom Kippur, this is not organized religion. This is disorganized religion." So generally, we're not that organized. Passover night, we're organized. And we do it outside of Israel 2 nights. Someone once asked, why don't we do it 3 nights? Because in Jewish law, anything you do 3 times becomes a pattern, becomes a fixed pattern. We don't want to make order that fixed in our lives. Sometimes a little chaos is good. A little disorganization is good for us. People who are fixated, they're obsessive compulsive. And my brother once had a student who comes to him the last night of Passover, the 8th night. He says, "I can't handle this anymore. Do we have to do a Seder tonight as well?" He didn't know that you'd only do it twice. He did it for 7 nights. And he almost went crazy. So, yes, we do have to be organized, structured, but we do it just 1 night in Israel and 2 nights outside of Israel.
Why 2 nights outside of Israel?
Because every holiday, biblical holiday in the diaspora, in the olden days, they didn't know when the holiday would begin because it was determined by the sighting of the moon, and the court in Jerusalem would determine when the holiday would begin. And since people lived outside of Israel would never get the information in time, they would always add on another day. Right, so even though now we know, because we go by a calendar, but we follow the custom of our ancestors. And the spiritual reason is that outside of Israel, we need an extra day to absorb the spiritual energy. In Israel, they can do it in fewer days. Okay, the first thing we do after listing all the 15 items is we recite Kiddush. Kiddush is the sanctification of the holiday, which we do every Friday night for Shabbos. Oh, yes, women light the candles before. And if they didn't light it before, they can light it later also. Unlike Shabbos, where you have to light it before sunset, on a holiday you could light it later. And the only thing you have to make sure is that you light it from an existing flame if you light it later. Can create a flame on a holiday. And after you light the candles, then you say the Kiddush on a cup of wine. That's the first cup of wine. Then you wash your hands, because you're going to dip a vegetable in salt water, and I don't want to go into that, why you wash your hands at that point, but you wash your hands as if you were eating bread, but we don't recite this special blessing. You eat the vegetable. Some people use parsley, some people use celery, some people use an onion, some people use a potato. Any vegetable you could use except for the bitter herbs that you reserve for later. Okay, and then you take the middle matzah. There are 3 matzahs. You take the middle matzah, break it into 2. The larger part you hide for the end of the meal. Then you're ready to say the Haggadah, which is what we're focusing on today. The first paragraph reads, "This is the bread of affliction that our fathers ate in the land of Egypt. Whoever is hungry, let him come and eat. Whoever is in need, let him come and conduct the Seder of Passover. This year, we are here. Next year in the land of Israel. This year we are slaves. Next year we will be free people." These are 3 disjointed statements. What are they talking about? And then also the question that is asked, there are many questions, I'll just mention 2. One question is, this is the bread of affliction that our fathers ate in the land of Egypt. They ate the matzah going out of Egypt. Why do we eat matzah on Passover? Because they were leaving the land in such haste that they didn't have enough time for the dough to rise. So they had to bake whatever dough they had to bake it immediately, and it didn't rise, so it was matzah. That's what it says in the Haggadah itself later on. So why over here is it talking about the matzah we ate in Egypt? Yes, they ate matzah in Egypt, but that's not why we eat matzah the night of Passover. We eat matzah the night of Passover because of what we ate when we left Egypt. And shouldn't that be the focus of what we ate when we left Egypt? That's one question. And the second question is, the second paragraph, whoever is hungry, let him come and eat. Remember, when is this said? It's said at the beginning of the Seder, not even all the way in the beginning. It's after we already drank a cup of wine and we did a few rituals. You know, how many people are going to hear that invitation? If you're sitting at your table, the doors are shut, the windows presumably are not open, although maybe in some places you could have open windows. But who's going to listen to your invitation who doesn't already have an invitation? Why would you be inviting people in middle of the Seder? Anyone who's, hey, is it to make yourself feel good that you invited 4 people who could never hear the invitation? No, there are sometimes people who will invite people to their homes knowing that the person will say no. And if the person dares say yes, they don't know what to do. Well, that's what it sounds like. You're inviting people when you know that no one is going to hear your invitation. So the Rebbe once gave a talk on this, and he connected it to the whole Haggadah. It's like, I remember, I wasn't there when the Rebbe said it, but came a few days later, and they told me the Rebbe would have, on the second night of Passover, after the Seder, which would end around midnight, at 1 a.m., he would give a talk to the crowd. There were hundreds of people there. Some of them were half sleeping because they drank at least 4 cups of wine, if not more. So the Rebbe would sit down and he would give a talk for 20 minutes to a half hour. They would sing something. He would give another talk and another. It would go from 1 a.m. to about 5 or 6 a.m., the second night of Passover. And one year he gave a talk. He just asked a bunch of questions. Took him about 20 minutes, and he didn't give an answer. So they thought the next talk will give an answer. No, he went to another part of the Haggadah, and he gave a talk and just asked questions. And this went on for about 2 hours. He was just taking different parts of the Haggadah and asking questions. And then at the end, he gave one answer that answered all the questions and tied all the parts of the Haggadah into one whole. And that is later on was published. And if we had to translate it to English, it would be about 30, 40 pages. So I'm just taking one little snippet of what he said. So this paragraph is an introductory paragraph. Remember, you're having people at the Seder, children who are inquisitive, and they're encouraged to ask questions. There's a very, very basic question that everyone who thinks, and usually children are much more astute than adults, but even adults could sometimes think straight. We're not that foolish. And what is the question? The question is, if God took us out of Egypt, he liberated us, and in doing so, he also promised us wealth, why is it that we are still in exile? And why is it that there are still poor people that we had to invite to the Seder? Does God's work, did his work fail? Is he imperfect? God, of course, is perfect. If God does something and he promises something, how could it not endure? If God took us out of Egypt and liberated us, we should have never returned to a state of exile. And I know some people might be thinking, we're in America, we're not in exile, we're not slaves. Yes, we are. In a mild form, we have to pay taxes, and are paying it to the United States government, not to Israel. So we are in exile. And besides that, there are places where Jews are not as free. Well, we're living in probably the best period of all of Jewish history, where Jews are free virtually in every nook and cranny of the world. The only place where, even Iran, Jews are free there. There's not very much anti-Semitism in Iran, believe it or not. There's anti-Israeli sentiment, but not anti-Semitism. I heard this from an Iranian Jewish young man who sat at my table, and he told me he got out of Iran maybe 10 years ago or so. He says in Tehran, he would walk with his yarmulke in the street. He never got any anti-Semitic reactions. So Jews are freer today than ever before, but still we don't have the third temple. We still have enemies. We still have Iran trying to build nuclear weapons So the world is still an imperfect world. So why is it an imperfect world? God took us out of Egypt and we're free and everything is great. And then God promised wealth. So why are there still people suffering from poverty? At least the freed slaves should never have to suffer from poverty. Our anti-Semites claim that we're all rich. That would be nice, but we're not all rich. And there are many, many poor Jews. So that's a question that the child could ask, which doesn't allow him to go through the rest of the Seder. What's the point in going through the Seder if it doesn't make any sense why we are still in the state of exile and we still have poverty and suffering? And the answer is that when we came out of Egypt, we took the bread of affliction with us. You know the famous, paraphrase of famous saying, you can take the Jew out of Egypt, but you can't take the Egypt out of the Jew. In other words, God could take us out of exile, but if we take our exile with us, which is symbolized by bread of affliction means bread that represents a mindset of affliction, a mindset of poverty, a mindset of a lack of sophistication. You know, they tell this story of this beggar who used to go around begging, and he won the lottery, $100 million. So they asked him, what is he going to do with $100 million? He says, I'm going to put elevators in all of the high-rise apartments, and when I go begging, I wouldn't have to go up the stairs. That's called being rich, but being poor in your wealth. When a person has wealth, and they don't appreciate their wealth, and they look at the world around them with impoverished eyes, that is eating bread of affliction. Even as you're going out of Egypt, you're taking the bread of affliction that we ate in Egypt as slaves. And that's why we had to announce, whoever is hungry, let him come and eat. That's why there's still poverty, because we left with poverty. God took us out, but God does not force us to accept the new reality if we're not ready for it. So God gave us the opportunity to be free, but freedom, again, is only a means. We didn't take advantage of those means, and that's why we degenerated and we lost some of that freedom. And that's why we had to finally, that's why we have to celebrate this Passover, because we have to get out of that state of impoverishment and slavery. And even though one could say, so then what's the point of observing the Seder if we're still slaves? Because yes, this year we may still be slaves in a mild form. Next year we'll be free. Because every time we observe the Seder, we get rid of another part of our slave mentality, of our impoverished mentality. Then we come to the 4 questions. Before we tell the story, it's in a form of question and answer. In the Torah, it says, if your child will ask you this question, this is what you should tell him. So you see from there that we're supposed to do it in the manner of a question and answer. And the question is, why is this night different from all the other nights? You know the story of the chief rabbi of England, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks? I'm sure you heard this story. Jonathan Sacks was knighted by the Queen. He was called Rabbi, Doctor, Lord, Sir Jonathan Sacks. He had a lot of. He was in the House of Lords, but he was knighted. And when you're knighted, apparently, you're supposed to recite some words in Latin. So he tried to memorize it, and he's together with a few other people who are being knighted. And when he had to say those words, he had a senior moment, and he couldn't remember the Latin. So he decided to say some words in Hebrew. No one will know the difference. So he says, "Ma nishtana halayla hazeh mikol halelos." And the Queen looks at him and says, "Why is this night different from all other nights?" That's an old one. I think they tell it about other people besides the chief rabbi. Anyhow, why is this night different from all other nights? Now, if you look at the 4 questions, there are actually 4 statements. Instead of saying, why is it that on all other nights we're not required to dip even once, and this night we dip twice? It's a statement. On other nights, we're not required to dip even once, on this night we dip twice. And the same thing with the other 3. So there are many, many interpretations of this. But this is one interpretation that focuses on why is this night of Passover different from all the other nights of the year, when all other nights, we mentioned the Exodus, but they're not considered to be nights of freedom. Why are we more convinced that we're going to get out of this situation that we're in and experience freedom? What is it that this night gives us that no other night gives us? And there are 4 answers. The order of the 4 questions or the 4 statements vary from one community to another. This is the Chabad order, which is based on Maimonides. On all other nights, we're not required to dip even once. And this night, we dip twice. Why do we dip? We take the vegetable and we dip it in salt water. So everyone gives the reason for salt water, and I never found a source for it, that salt water reminds us of the tears. But why dipping? Why dipping a vegetable in salt water? So the reason given, interestingly, is that it's to get children to ask the question. Because what we're supposed to do this night is to get children to ask questions. How do you get a child to ask a question? When you do things differently. When he sees things that are not the routine. So we never take a vegetable at the beginning of a meal and dip it in salt water. So the child will be very curious. So the question is, so what are we supposed to tell the child? We're supposed to tell the child that there is no reason for it. The reason is that you should ask questions. We're doing things differently. So what's the point over there? And the answer is that our problem with what keeps us in slavery, and again, what do I mean by slavery? Whenever we find ourselves in a rut, we can't get out of it. Whatever it is, whether it's an addiction, whether it's a lifestyle, whether it's behavior, whether it's a mood, we're always depressed, we're always anxious. We all have our handicaps that keep us enslaved. How do we get out of it? So one step is you have to start doing things differently. You have to act differently, even if you're not feeling different. Because human beings are created as physical beings, and we're influenced by physical behavior. If you want to get out of your routine, which is not good, act as if you're doing a different routine. Do things differently. If a person finds that they're locked up in their home, they're quarantined, which is a very popular word these days, and they don't feel like going out, that's when they should go out. Do something that is different from your routine. Because the worst thing for enslavement is to continue to be enslaved. Free yourself from your habits. And that will give you emotional relief as well. There's a famous medieval commentator known as the Chinuch, lived about 800 years ago, where he explains the 613 commandments. He lists every single one of them, and he gives an explanation for them. And he repeats this theme over and over again. He says, why is the Torah so focused on actions? He says, because human beings are influenced by their actions. Most people will say, our actions are influenced by our feelings. And that's true as well. But it also goes the other way around, that our feelings are created by our actions. If you keep on acting kindly, you will become a kind person. If you keep on acting cruelly, even if you are a kind person, you will become cruel. People are influenced by their behavior. Yes?
So, is the reason why the Seder is at home instead of like in a, like in a shul?
It could be in a shul. I mean,
because they want children to be a part of it, to ask the question?
Absolutely. Seder is, it's interesting. In the Torah, when it talks about Passover, the first Passover, it talks about how all the Jewish people have to bring this paschal offering, but then it focuses on each family. It focuses on the family. That Judaism believes that we shouldn't be overly focused on universal matters. We shouldn't be here to solve the problems with coronavirus. We should focus on our own individual lives and our families and our communities. What is that slogan? Think globally but act locally. Well, that's a Jewish idea. I'm sure Jews were the ones who made it up. But it's true. We have to think about saving the whole world, but don't try to work on saving the whole world, because you'll save nobody. Work on saving yourself and your community, and then it builds outwardly. Only very holy people like a Moses can take the larger picture and bring it down to the individual. We have to take the individual and expand it to the collective. So that's what we do on the night of Passover. We act differently. And by acting differently, and I think if people are normally accustomed to eating supper at 6 o'clock, act differently and eat your supper at 9 o'clock. I know it's not your routine, but this is what Passover is all about, breaking out of your routine. And if your routine is already good, change again. That's why we dip twice. Because there are people who say, 1 second, my routine is perfect. I'm not depressed, I'm not an addict, I'm comfortable, I'm doing everything right. Says, yeah, but that's then you're stagnating. Change again. In other words, never stay on the same level. Always have to change in order to be truly free. So that's one reason why this night is different, because this night we change. The second reason is we eat matzah, not chametz. What's the difference between chametz and matzah? Very, very insignificant difference, but a major difference at the same time. Most people will tell you chametz, leaven, has yeast in it. That's not true. Matzah can be just as chametz as matzah. If you ever notice when you buy matzah, it will say on the package, not for Passover use. Why isn't it for Passover use? It looks like matzah, it tastes like matzah, it must be a duck.
Not made cleanly?
What?
It's not.
It's not watched that it shouldn't rise. In other words, if you leave dough unattended for more than 18 minutes, it'll automatically become chametz. Even if you don't see it rising, there's already a chemical process that is happening that starts the process of rising. So even if you don't see the rise, it's there. It's there. In other words, flour and water by itself is matzah. If you let it rise, that means there's some air in it, it's chametz. It's absolutely forbidden. What does that symbolize? The difference between an ego and humility. On the night of Passover, we eat matzah, we internalize the idea of humility. You want to be free. If your ego is a swollen ego, an inflated ego, you cannot be free, because everything that gets in the way of your ego will put you down. You cannot tolerate anything in your life that gets in your way. It makes your space smaller, because that's what egotists are. Egotists are people who occupy space. Well, we all occupy space, but no, we don't occupy space in reality. It says in the Mishnah, Ethics of the Fathers, one of the miracles in the temple was that nobody ever complained that it's too crowded for me to sleep over in Jerusalem. Jerusalem in biblical times was much smaller than Jerusalem today, and yet you had a few million people there on Passover. Josephus and the Talmud say the same thing about the number of lambs that were slaughtered for Passover. A few 100,000. How many people could eat the meat of one lamb? Could probably have 20 people easily. So you're talking about well over 1 million, maybe 2 million people congregating in Jerusalem, a much smaller city than it is today. And nobody ever complained it was tight. Of course it was tight. But people were not filled with their egos when they were under that spiritual influence. There was enough room for everybody. One man once came to a rabbi and he said, you know, wherever I go, when I come to the synagogue, everyone steps over me. So the rabbi said, if you wouldn't spread yourself out to cover the entire area of the synagogue, people wouldn't have to step on you. They'd have plenty of room to step without stepping on you. You spread yourself out because your ego is so big, wherever they'll step, it'll be on you. That's not called free. A person who's a matzah personality is a very free person. And when you're free, you're happy as well. Humble people are happy. Arrogant people are never happy. The third thing, bitter herbs we eat. If you ever eat horseradish, freshly ground horseradish, it's very, very bitter. There's actually an opinion that says you can't grind the horseradish, you have to eat it whole. So I remember I was at the Rebbe Seder twice, and the Rebbe would take enough horseradish the size of a tennis ball, yeah. And he would squeeze it, he'd squeeze out all the liquid, and he turned it into a very, very solid mass of ground horseradish. Then he would take a slice of horseradish, a big slice, and wrap a leaf of lettuce around it. And he would cough terribly when he would eat it. But that's how we would eat the bitter herbs. And he didn't say why he ate so much of it. He ate more than he had to. Whereas the matzah, he ate a minimum amount of whatever the requirement is, but the bitter herbs, he ate a lot. And my understanding was that the Rebbe was saying, I want to endure all the bitterness so others don't have to endure bitterness. I'll take the bitterness so others don't have to. But anyhow, when we eat something bitter, it jolts us. Sometimes you need a jolt. You have to have electric shock treatment to wake us up from our reverie. And the fourth thing is we recline. As I mentioned before, we recline is a symbol of royalty. We're aristocrats, we're royalty. People don't change because they think they can't change. They think they're stuck in a rut, and that's the way it's going to be. And they feel that they're nobodies, they're insignificant. The worst thing is self-delusion when it comes to not appreciating our own qualities. Rabbi Dr. Twersky, the famous psychiatrist, we spoke in Buffalo several times, and one of his favorite themes is the problem with delusion that we suffer from. And he said, I remember very vividly, he would say, if someone would come with his hand inside his bosom and say that he's Napoleon, what would we say? This person needs to be hospitalized. Delusion. He says, well, why, if people say, I'm a nobody, I'm worthless, I have no qualities, I'm not smart, or I'm not good, and they put themselves down, that's just as delusional as saying you're Napoleon. But yet, those people are not put away. But it's just as sick, and it's just as destructive. He would tell stories of how this very accomplished woman, she was a PhD, and she was extremely accomplished in every way, and she was telling him how big of a failure she was. And of course, that was he put a lot of effort into the positive reinforcement that we have to give ourselves, that we have to realize that we are royalty. It's not just acting out freedom by reclining. It's there to remind us of how we are royalty and that we shouldn't put ourselves down. There's actually another reason, I'll conclude with this, and the other things we'll leave for next week, God willing. There's actually another reason why we recline. And it almost sounds like a contradictory reason. In Hebrew, the word for reclining is haseva. Haseva. Where does that word, or the root of that word, occur in the Torah? When the Jews left Egypt, God took them in a circular way. Vayasev is the term that's used. And he took them around. He used, instead of going, if this is Egypt and this is Israel, what's the way to go? You go like that. And instead, they went like this, in a circle. Why? Because God didn't want them to go through the land of the Philistines, the Gaza, because they might be confronting war, and they'll get scared, and they'll run back to Egypt. So instead, he took them in a circuitous route, circular route, to get to Israel. And the word for taking you around is cognate, is related to the word haseva, which is reclining. Now, aren't these two opposite reasons? One reason is given for reclining, it's a sign of royalty, that we're really free. The other reason is that the Jews were so infected with a slave mentality that they'd go back to Egypt to become slaves rather than being free at the slightest provocation. So is it a sign of freedom, or is it a sign of slavery? And we know on Passover night we have both models. We eat matzah because it's a bread of affliction. We eat matzah because it's the bread they ate when they left Egypt. So we do have themes that carry in them opposites. But if you really think about it, they're not opposites. And the reason is as follows. There's a famous story in the Talmud of a great rabbi, Rabbi Yehoshua, who was known for his brilliance, who never lost a debate with any philosopher, Greek philosopher, Roman philosopher. The only time he ever lost a debate was with a child. He said he was once traveling to get to a certain destination, and there's a fork in the road. And Yogi Berra wasn't around to tell him to take it. So he asked the child there, which road should I take to get to the city? And the child said, well, if you take the road on the right, that's the short but long way. If you take the route on the left, that's the long but short way. So the rabbi, like most people, you hear the first thing that someone says, and he heard the word short. He ignored the fact that he said short but long. So he takes the short route, and he sees the city very close. And at the time he gets to the city, there's a huge obstruction, a wall, impossible to climb over. So we retrace the steps to the child, and he says, you told me this is the short route. He says, but I said the short but long. The other route is a long route, circuitous, but it finally gets you there. There are no obstructions. So he said, that was the only time I lost the debate with someone, with that child. And that's a very profound debate. It wasn't just about not hearing words. Because in life, we have people who take the short route to get things done, but it's the long route because it doesn't last. They never get to their goal. They want instant gratification, instant achievement, instant results. People who work hard, who take the long route, are really getting there because they get in there. It's theirs. When you are freed from Egypt, and if the Jews would have gone the short route, yeah, they would have been free, but it wouldn't have been internalized. By going the long route, they were able to internalize their freedom. And once you internalize it, it's yours, and it's not something that you will lose so easily. So that's why when we recline, we have two reasons to recline. One of the reasons is it's a sign that we're free. But the other reason is that your freedom is a gained freedom. It's an earned freedom. It's a freedom that was created not just by being plucked out of Egypt, but by going through the desert in 40 years. You were trained, you were motivated, you were conditioned, and you finally got there. You're really free. And the same could be said about Jewish history. We have a long, winding history of 3,300 years plus. If you go by Abraham, it's about 3,800 years. But we'll finally get there. That's what we've been praying for and waiting for the ultimate redemption. It's taken so long, and we don't like that it's taking so long, but we know when we're going to get there, we'll be there. Because we have been trained, we have been conditioned, we have been tested. And even though as individuals, some of us may be a little shaky and a little bit raw, as a people, we have been conditioned. We are a hardened people, and we could when we get to our destination, we'll be there totally. And that's what we think of when we recline. It's not just playing an act. It's internalizing this idea of true freedom, freedom that will endure forever. Any questions? Yes.
What about the lamb which was supposed to be eaten and the temple is not there?
So according to Jewish law, without the temple, we're not allowed to offer sacrifices. So we're not allowed to eat the lamb. In fact, we're not allowed to even say, when you eat meat on Passover, I'm designating this meat for Passover because it resembles the Paschal lamb. We're not allowed to do that. We do have a commemoration of it by putting a shank bone, and many people use a chicken neck because no one will ever confuse a chicken for a lamb for a chicken. So what we do in place of eating the lamb, we eat an extra piece of matzah. That's in place of the lamb. When Mashiach comes and we'll build a third temple, we'll go back to eating the lamb. In fact, we don't even eat the night of Passover, the Seder night, we don't eat roasted meat. Even if not even chicken. If you eat the chicken, you put some liquid in the pan So it shouldn't resemble the Paschal offering, which was completely roasted on fire without any liquid. That's how far we're not allowed to try to simulate any type of sacrifice. But the prophet Hosea says that our lips take the place of our sacrifices. This is true about all sacrifices, that our prayers take the place. But Passover specifically, it's not just the prayers, it's also the actual eating of a piece of matzah and symbolizing the Paschal lamb by putting it on the Seder plate, a chicken neck or a shank bone, which we don't even eat.
So the chicken bone is there, but it's just like symbolically.
It's just there symbolically. In fact, Chabad has a custom to take off the meat from it, so it shouldn't in any remote way be considered a Paschal offering, even though a chicken can't be ever used as an offering, just to not to distance ourselves from the actual offering, but we do it symbolically and replace it by saying the words and by eating the matzah. Yes?
So, when you make challah, you take a little bit of the challah
And
and
you-
you burn it,
Right.
and that's supposed to symbolize the.
Well, the challah is supposed to be given to the Kohen, but since we are not ritually qualified to eat challah, we burn it instead.
Okay, so that's not, that's not,
That's not a sacrifice. No.
You also get challah from the matzahs.
Right. When,
so you do take it from a matzah.
oh yeah, sure.
When they bake, you see on the packages that challah was taken.
When they bake it, they take a piece of the dough and they separate it as challah and they burn it.
Right, but that's not, doesn't represent the sacrifice.
No. See, there are sacrifices that were offered on the altar in the temple, and then there's what you have to give a Kohen, the gifts that you give to the Kohen, which includes a percentage of your grain. And one of the laws is that when you have dough, a percentage of the dough has to be given to the Kohen. Now we can't give it to the Kohen because he's not ritually clean to eat sanctified food, so we burn it instead.
All right, so it should say even on the kosher for Passover matzah, it should say.
It usually says challah was taken. It's all of them, anyone that's under any supervision. And as far as I know, all matzah is under supervision. I don't know too many people who are going to bake matzah not under supervision because no one will buy it. Yes?
If chicken is not the sacrificial animal, how it ended up in kapara ritual?
That's probably why. So it shouldn't resemble a sacrifice.
Well, but it is some kind of a sacrifice.
Well, it's a makeshift type of sacrifice that it's not the real thing. That's right. It would be also harder to swing a cow or a lamb, but that's not the reason. It's because it's not a real sacrifice. Okay. So, God willing, next week, I hope Corona doesn't keep us away.